Hello, I suppose it's appropriate that we turn our attention to existentialism in a moment of existential crisis. Not that I think the species is about to disappear from the planet, but we're certainly at a point where previous certainties are called suddenly and radically into question. And existentialism is a philosophy which demands of us that we understand and interpret our lives without reference to absolutes, without references to the sorts of guarantees that Plato and, in his own way, Ibn Rushd believed existed. So let me begin, before turning to de Beauvoir's text, to situate existentialism not only in the history of philosophy, but in the history of our class, so unfortunately disrupted by the coronavirus crisis. However, it's serious and we have to make adjustments. And I hope these videos help explain the notes, but we shall see. So we began our time together in January looking at Plato, and in Platonic philosophy, the truth, the real, and the good all coincide. Right? Just imagine it. Imagine your hand as the transcendent reality of the forms, and the rational part of the soul as your other hand. And for Plato, if we thought correctly, these two would match up, and we will be able to guide our lives by reference to this transcendent reality. Right? We became attuned to it. Ibn Rushd agreed. He argued that we don't have to fear philosophical reason. It will lead to the same truths as are revealed in Scripture. But, we'll recall, Ibn Rushd also noted that where there is a conflict between the revelations of Scripture and the conclusions of philosophical reason, the educated are entitled to interpret Scripture allegorically. And that introduces a problem that Ibn Rushd wasn't conscious of. The problem that it ultimately introduces is that it, in effect, puts reason in command of Scripture. For if we are allowed to interpret Scripture allegorically, right? Remember the allegory of the cave. It said one thing literally, it meant something else. What that in effect does is elevate philosophical reason over revealed truth. And that argument runs all the way through Hume's Dialogues on Natural Religion. I won't repeat all the arguments, but the essential point of contention between Demea on the one hand and Philo and Cleanthes on the other is whether and to what extent we should think about God at all. Demea says we should just accept on faith what is in Holy Scripture. Cleanthes and Philo, on the other hand, argue back and forth about whether we can know the nature of God. The important point going forward from Hume to existentialism is to remember that both Cleanthes and Philo accept that meaningful ideas must be rooted in experience. But Philo contends that human experience is limited and uncertain and only gives us so much information useful for purposes of human life. We can never access transcendent realities. We can never know the ultimate truth about reality, right? So if Plato had human reason and cosmic reason together, by the time of Hume, in the middle of the 17th century, these are beginning to pull apart. Existentialism emerges in a world where they have become completely apart. It's not that this transcendent world might not exist. It's that human reason, human intelligence can never know it for certain. And so existentialism asks us to try to reason philosophically and ethically without that certainty. It's not necessarily an atheistic philosophy. One of the most important existentialists, indeed perhaps the first existentialist, was the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, who was a deeply religious person. But Kierkegaard, rather like de Mea, argued that God is a transcendent mystery. Right? We can't know God by means of science, and if we could, it wouldn't be God. The nature of God is absurd from the standpoint of scientific reason, and that's why we should believe in it, according to Kierkegaard. Right? The idea of the leap of faith comes from Kierkegaard's philosophy. It's madness, in a sense, to believe that there is some omniscient, omnipotent, loving being up there somewhere. But that's exactly why we have to commit ourselves to it. And so Kierkegaard is one of the most important and earliest existentialists because he focuses on the power and the centrality of subjective commitment. Right? We can have no objective knowledge of God, but we can subjectively commit ourselves to belief in it. Right? And so I think we should think of existentialism as a philosophy of commitment, of subjective commitment, rather than a philosophy, an atheistic or nihilistic philosophy. Right? Nietzsche, another very important forerunner of 20th century existentialism, is really a philosophy of subjective commitment to the value of life, even if there's no objective grounds to accept that. Right? Nietzsche believes that we are in an age where God is dead, which doesn't mean necessarily that God doesn't exist. It means that God cannot provide direction in life. We have to choose that on our own. And we have to choose it in light of the inevitability of our own death. And so a third very important forerunner of existential philosophy, Martin Heidegger, right, draws our attention to the experience of human life in time that begins when we are, as he says, thrown into being. We are born, we don't choose to be born, and we gradually become aware that our lives are all oriented and tend towards our inevitable death. Right? And so this intensifies the feeling of being a subject, being somebody called upon, indeed forced to choose. And it's that idea of being forced to choose that I think is essential to Simone de Beauvoir's ethics of ambiguity. What we know of as what is, typically or in a cliched, caricatured way called existentialism, the cigarette-smoking, beret-wearing French philosopher, emerges in Paris before the Second World War, but it was after the Second World War that it really attained its heyday, for obvious reasons. Right? The Second World War was of such awesome destructive power, it unsettled all certainties. Right? How can there be a God and there be the Holocaust? How can 60 million of people have been killed in this way? How do we reconcile ourselves as ethical subjects, as subjects committed to the good, and be the same people, the same species who did all this? Right? So it's a time of profound uncertainty, a time of profound ambiguity. Right? So to turn to the text, right? Ambiguity means, in the most general sense, lack of clarity. Right? An ambiguous phrase or an ambiguous word, we don't know what it means. And we don't know what it means because it can mean its meaning can be one thing or the opposite. The ambiguity of human life, the ambiguity that, the ethics of ambiguity that de Beauvoir explores in her book, is rooted in the two sides of human beings. On the one hand, we are natural creatures, right? Part of nature, part of society, dependent on the world, dependent on other people. Right? But on the other hand, we are beings who are essentially free, right? Free in the sense that nothing happens unless we make choices. Right? This video is a function of my choosing to make it. Right? I was mandated by the university administration to create an alternative format for the delivery of the courses because of the crisis. But they can't compel me to do it. Right? Ultimately, whatever field of forces I exist within, and any of us exist within, We have to choose. Right? If we don't choose in human life, nothing happens. I've chosen to continue to drink tea just as I do in the regular lectures. It's a little bit awkward, but please bear with me. So, we have to choose. We're confronted with a crisis. We decide how to respond. Right? One of the great works of French existential philosophy and literature, Albert Camus' La Peste, or The Plague, which I highly recommend you all read at this moment in time, is about a group of people whose town is invaded unexpectedly by the plague, and they choose to stay and fight. Right? And they choose to stay and fight not because they want to defeat the enemy, because they commit themselves to each other. Whether they win or they lose, their choice is to commit themselves to doing what they can to address the problem. Right? And we're in a similar situation, aren't we? Right? We have to choose how we respond to this crisis. There's no guidance. Even if there are rules, and this is crucial, even if there are rules, they don't determine how we respond. We can choose to follow them, we can choose not to follow them. Right? But it's only our choice that activates whatever it is we do. And moreover, this is also crucially important, we don't know what's going to happen. Right? The ambiguity of human life, that we're natural creatures on the one hand and choosers on the other, is that we don't know if our choices are going to work out. Right? And that's the scary thing about life. I mean, a constant refrain of de Beauvoir's argument is that anxiety is part of human life. And anxiety is a function of the uncertainty built into our freedom. Freedom, choice, responsibility, they're synonymous, right? Nothing happens unless we choose. Nothing outside of the self can ultimately cause us to choose one thing or the other, right? Which means we're free. But because we're free, and because what we do follows from a choice, our free choice, we are ultimately responsible. Now, this leads to the most common objection to existentialism, which is that if there is no ultimate guidance, right, no Plato's transcendent realm that we map our reason onto, or at least not one that we can be certain of, then it licenses everything. Nothing matters, nothing is true, and everything is permitted, as Dostoevsky said. So I just want to turn to the text for a moment at that point to think this through. This is on page 15 in chapter 1. She writes, "But if man is free to define for himself the conditions of a life which is valid in his own eyes, can he not choose whatever he likes and act however he likes? Dostoevsky asserted, if God does not exist, everything is permitted." That quotation from Dostoevsky comes from his great novel, The Brothers Karamazov. Right? She continues, "Today's believers use this formula for their own advantage. To reestablish man at the heart of his destiny is, they claim, to repudiate all ethics. However, far from God's absence authorizing all license, the contrary is the case. Because man is abandoned on the earth, because his acts are definitive, absolute engagements, he bears the responsibility for a world which is not the work of a strange power, but of himself, where his defeats are inscribed and his victories as well. A God can pardon, efface, and compensate, but if God does not exist, man's faults are inexpiable." So we absolutely need to understand this passage. It's probably the most important passage in the first chapter. What is she saying? Right? First of all, what she's saying is that it does not follow, as many religious believers think it follows, that if God doesn't exist, we can do anything we want. Right? Secondly, however, she is suggesting that it is better for human life if God does not exist, because if we understand the implications of that, We understand that we are responsible for all of our acts. A, we cannot justify ourselves by appeal to God. B, we cannot pray to God for forgiveness if we screw up. It is up to us and us alone. Now again, I caution she's not making a metaphysical assertion that God does or does not exist. She's saying that while we are on earth, we know only the contexts of our in which call upon us to choose, and we don't know whether there is any divine authority ultimately judging us. So if we think from within the human perspective, which we always must do ultimately, we will understand that the need to choose implies our freedom, and our freedom entails our responsibility. So, if things go wrong, if we sin, if we harm, if we destroy, that is on us. So, if we reflect upon this responsibility, it is at least possible that we take others into account. That we reflect upon what it might be good for people all condemned, so to speak, to live on this earth together, what it might be good for us to do together. Now, on the other hand, as we'll see in chapter 2, which I'll post the notes maybe tomorrow and the video discussion in the next couple of days, it's also possible that we can devote ourselves only to our own good, only to our own pleasure, exploit others, right? It could be true, as Dostoevsky said, that if God doesn't exist, nothing's true and everything's permitted. Right? That's the ambiguity. We cannot say definitively one thing more than the other. We have to live within that tension, live within that anxiety. Right? We live in a world right now, and I'm not talking about the coronavirus, but just if we go back a month before this crisis beset, where anxiety is thought to be a bad thing. For existential philosophers, anxiety is neither good nor bad, it's necessary and it's inescapable. We feel anxiety when we take human limitations seriously. We're anxious because we don't understand the future, and we can never understand the future precisely because the future as it plays out is dependent upon the choices of ourselves and all the other people in the world. We can never predict how it's going to happen, right? And so that lack of certainty generates the anxiety, right? Anxiety is a function of future-orientedness. That's why people say mindfulness is a cure for anxiety. If we stay in the present moment, we won't feel anxious. But from the existential perspective, we cannot stay in the moment. There is no present that we can separate off absolutely from the future. We're always projecting ourselves, right? That's what she talks about towards the end of the chapter. Right? Our life is a projection of goals, and we hope that they work out, but we can't guarantee it. And so anxiety is essential. It's a function of our lack of control over the future, but the need we have to choose anyway. But there's another side to it, right? Which is that anxiety, that stress, that tension, right? That's a sign that we're alive and that we want to be alive and that we're taking it seriously, right? If you don't ever take anything seriously, if you don't care, then you won't ever feel anxious. We feel anxious when we care. I've taught for more than 20 years, and the only times I have a bad lecture are the times when I don't feel any tension before I step into the room because my mind is elsewhere. Right? But the vast majority, I'm not saying all my classes are great, but the vast majority of time I feel a little bit of tension in the pit of my stomach before I go into the class, before I start talking. And it's not because I'm worried about how I'll be judged necessarily. It's because I'm uncertain of whether the way I plan the class to go will work out. Right? It's a sign that I'm taking it seriously. Right? Not in an ego-trippy sense, but I'm taking it seriously as what I am called upon to do in that context. So, I'll just come back to the text for a minute and then draw some general conclusions, because I don't want these things to go on for an hour and 20 minutes. That would be too much to ask. Right? So, first of all, page 24, very crucial passage. Freedom is the source from which all significations and all values spring. It is the original condition of all justification of existence. The man who seeks to justify his life must want freedom itself absolutely and above everything else. Okay? So, freedom is the source of value for human beings. Nothing out there is objectively and apart from our choices valuable. Value is a function of choice and nothing else. So again, existentialism is a philosophy of subjectivity, of choice, of freedom, of commitment. Something is valuable to us if we commit ourselves to it. Is it absolutely valuable? You can't answer that question. Could commitment to one set of values be disastrous? Absolutely. Can we know that beforehand? No, we cannot. Right? So if we want to justify ourselves, right, we have to accept the responsibility that comes with being the free subject that decides how they will live. Even if you want to unburden yourself, we'll see in the next chapter, you can't. Right? So freedom is the source of all values. And that means that there are different value systems that can conflict, but it also means that there's no ultimate way of reconciling them. There is no Platonic sage, no Platonic philosopher that can sort everybody's life out for themselves. Even if you commit yourself to a guru, to a sage, to a Platonic philosopher, you are choosing to give yourself over, right? And thus you have not really given yourself over. You are always condemned to your freedom. Right? As she says on the next page, 25, everyone is originally free in the sense that they can spontaneously cast themselves into the world. And then over onto page, bottom of page 32. But a new question is immediately raised. If man has one and only one way to save his existence, how can he choose not to choose in all cases? How is a bad willing possible? Well, a bad willing is possible because, the only form of bad willing is the will to unburden yourself of this responsibility. Right? So if existentialism is a philosophy of subjectivity, of choice, of commitment, the bad choice is to choose some way of unburdening yourself of having to choose. And that's the focus of the second chapter, all of the ways in which we try to empty ourselves into the objective world, right? God made me do it, the devil made me do it, my partner made me do it, history made me do it, my genetic code made me do it. These are all ways of trying to evade freedom and evade choice, all of which are illegitimate. From de Beauvoir's perspective, we have to stick with the ambiguity of human life if we really want to live, right? But really wanting to live as an ethical subject, right? As somebody committed not just to my own private good, but to good for human beings, creatures like us. So I will wrap it up at that point for today. I will return to the video world in a couple of days with my thoughts on the second chapter. In the meantime, please email me if you have questions. If you have more complex questions, we can chat by phone. I understand this is a difficult time for you. It's a difficult time for everybody, but I'm sure a disruption of this magnitude towards the end of your term is not what you wanted. I hope these substitute in some way for our in-class meetings. I'm very upset not to be able to meet with you. I really liked the energy in the room, and I was impressed with your contributions. However, we have to adjust. We can't predict the future, and this is teaching us that lesson. So it's a very appropriate lesson for us to learn, given that our final focus was existential philosophy. So email if you have any questions, and I will reach out to you by video again in the next couple of days.